Great. So I think we'll get started. I'm delighted to be here to open the session. We have an excellent panel today, and the topic is a voluntary principles risk assessment. We'll be getting some different perspectives on the table. I'm delighted to introduce the moderator today, Reg Manhas, a fellow Canadian who I've known for many years. Reg is the principal of Purcell Global Strategies. He built and led the external affairs and sustainability functions at Calgary-based Talisman Energy, and most recently at Dallas-based Kosmos Energy. Reg has been actively engaged in the voluntary principles for many years and served on the VP Steering Committee in 2011. He was also appointed in 2007 by the Government of Canada as one of two corporate advisory group members to the National Roundtables on CSR, the Canadian extractive sector in developing countries, and that was quite a process that ultimately led to some real reforms in Canada. So I'm delighted to turn it over to you, Reg, to moderate the session.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maura. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate here today. It's really great to reconnect with you and all the panelists and continue to engage with the voluntary principles of security and human rights. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure today to moderate a panel of real experts and actually old friends. So it's great in that regard. When I was talking to Maura about the presentation or the panel, we realized that there were going to be quite a wide variety of participants, not only VP's plenary group members that are participating or on the webinar. So we thought it might be a good idea to start by providing a little bit of an overview of the voluntary principles themselves and the risk assessment process. And then I will hand it over to our panelists to talk about recent trends that they've seen with respect to VP's risk assessments and more broadly, obviously COVID and other things that have had major impacts for the past 18 months or so. So perhaps I could just talk a little bit about the voluntary principles. I won't take much time on this, but the voluntary principles on security and human rights includes risk assessment as a key component of the principles. It goes without saying that the actors need to understand the risks that they and others face in order to prevent, mitigate, and effectively respond to such risks. Prior to starting business activities, companies should assess security risks, including harm to personnel and company assets, as well as risk of human rights abuses to external stakeholders, such as local communities, and especially vulnerable groups. Companies should regularly update risk and conflict analysis, including when major political, social, economic events occur. By regularly reviewing and verifying VP's related policies and practices, implementers can ensure that their approach remains current in changing contexts. The VPs note 6 non-exhaustive factors that need to be taken into account in a security and risk, human rights risk assessment. 1 is identification of security risks. 2, the potential for violence. Risk assessment should examine patterns of violence in areas of company operations for educational, predictive, and preventive purposes. Number 3, human rights records of security providers. Companies should establish procedures to help ensure that individuals allegedly implicated in human rights abuses do not provide security services for companies. 4, rule of law. Companies need to understand the capacity and willingness to hold potential perpetrators accountable in local jurisdictions. And 5, conflict analysis, understanding the root causes of local and national conflict. As we know, extractive industry activities can exacerbate existing tensions and conflicts or spark new ones. Risk associated with the transfer of lethal and non-lethal equipment to security providers. Companies should consider the risks of such transfers to prevent misappropriation of diversion of equipment, which may lead to human rights abuses. It's good practice to obtain information on a particular risk or risk area from 3 or more independent sources. Companies should include the needs and perspectives of vulnerable groups, such as human rights defenders, Indigenous peoples, women, and girls in local risk assessments. And clearly, community engagement is also key to understanding risks, establishing good stakeholder relations, and preventing problems before they get bigger. Companies should treat security activities and community engagement activities as related activities. So I'm going to turn it over now to our panel. I will introduce each panelist before they speak, but we've got just an amazing group of people here. We've got John Morrison, who will talk kind of on broader trends in terms of human rights and risks as they've evolved and from what he sees in his role. I'm then going to ask Melissa Whellams to talk and she'll speak from a more local community-based perspective in terms of all her on-the-ground experience. I'll then ask Krista Henry to speak, who has had just a wealth of experience from the beginning of the Voluntary Principles to her current work, which is working with many private companies as well as financial providers of capital to projects that may be working in risky areas. And finally, I'll ask Jamie Williamson to speak from the kind of private security perspective. So without further ado, I want to introduce John Morrison. So John has been the CEO of the Institute for Human Rights and Business since its foundation in 2009. He sits on advisory boards for 2 UK government ministers, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and currently co-chairs the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Human Rights. His first book was The Social License, published in 2014, and he's currently writing and broadcasting on issues related to the social environmental interface. He's a really busy guy, and we're really lucky to have him, and it's nice to call him a friend. So John, over to you.
Hi, Reg, and hello, everybody. It's a bit like Friends Reunited to be here today, and it's with great pleasure that I'll make some opening remarks, sort of the most general, I guess, in terms of trends around human rights risk assessment. We're now over 20 years of the Voluntary Principles, and certainly the first time I ever came across something called a human rights risk assessment was in the 1990s from the extractive sector, and I think it was sort of the Voluntary Principles in a way was one of the main things that started this whole methodology, and it's good to be revisiting this now. So what essentially do we mean by a human rights risk assessment as opposed to a social one or an environmental one? I mean, we could spend ages talking about that, but often it boils down to 2 things. I mean, human rights are risk to people, and people having agency and remedy in that equation. And we're talking about international standards and not just domestic standards. Now, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights came along after the VPs. We've just celebrated the 10 years last week, I think it was, of John Ruggie's work there. And John sort of put this concept of human rights risk assessment within the broader protect, respect, remedy framework. He puts a big premium on 2 commodities, I'd say: knowledge and transparency, knowing and showing. So knowing is this whole idea of human rights due diligence. How much can a company be expected to know about the harms and risks that might sit outside of its direct control? And this is very much where this whole idea of human rights impact assessment, human rights risk assessment is developed. What's interesting is the UNGPs don't ask you to do the human rights impact assessment or human rights risk assessment. They ask you to understand your risks and your impacts. Doesn't matter what you call it, right? So you can get into a tautological discussion about social impact assessments or environmental and social impact assessments. It really doesn't matter as long as your content is there. But I think the area where we've made less progress is the show part, the transport and that. But some of us have tried to make this issue of risk pre-competitive. A number of sector-based initiatives have disclosed sort of risk assessments on behalf of their members. And at IHRB, through our centres in Colombia and Myanmar, we developed several years ago sector-wide impact assessments, oil and gas and mining. And many of your companies and NGOs and governments were involved in that, to lift all ships, so to speak, in terms of not just business behaviour, but also civil society expectation and government awareness. Now, we're in a different place, I think, 10 years on. And Reg, I think you said at the beginning, you mentioned COVID. We're a bit of a perfect storm of transition, not just the transition in relation to building back after COVID, but the transition from high to low carbon to circular economies, the transition around automation and different forms of technology and how that's revolutionizing our supply chains, our value chains and our workplaces. So the question for me, at least today, is where does human rights risk assessment sit now within this sort of ESG, environmental, social governance discussion and ESG risk? Now, that's one trend. We've also in Europe got a move now to make human rights due diligence a mandatory issue, where the issue of disclosure would also then become a mandatory requirement. And of course, that's to some extent the case now in France. And we see this around some of the modern slavery legislation. So again, this issue is, you know, is human rights risk a competitive issue? Is it something that, for companies, or should we be following this train of enforced disclosure? And I think it should also be a boardroom issue. And I think the tailing dam review in the mining sector, and also the report of the Rio Tinto disaster in Western Australia and the abuse of cultural rights, both of those, I think, are good evidence for why human rights risk assessments need to be more of a strategic issue than they are today in the boardrooms of companies. And we need to make sure that the stakeholders affected have a voice and have agency that is being listened to. And obviously that's the case for Indigenous peoples with free, prior and informed consent, which is going to be even more important as we think about new commodities like copper and cobalt and these issues that the green economy is requiring. But I'd also say the just transition process of moving from high carbon to low carbon commodities and industries. How do we bring workers and communities with us on that journey? The penalty for not doing so politically is huge. So to end, I think we have a new struggle really of bringing social risk and human rights risk into these new conversations. I'll give you the example of TCFD, the task force for for carbon disclosures. Now this is the main framework, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, around the finance community and climate. But it doesn't even talk about social risk. It understands risk purely in environmental and technical terms. There's no mention of social risk, let alone human rights risk. And yet we know for carbon transitions, social issues, human rights issues are probably going to be one of the biggest hurdles ahead now. So I'll stop there, Reg. Just a few opening thoughts about where we are now on human rights risk assessment. Thank you.
No, thank you, John. That was great. Before we go any further, we have, I think, close to 85 participants on the line now, which is fantastic. We're going to set aside at least half the time for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A box versus the chat. I'm only going to have enough dexterity to look at one box. So if you could throw those questions into the Q&A, I'll try to collate and synthesize those and shoot them out to the panelists once we've gotten through everyone's presentation. So thank you for that. All right, Melissa, I will ask Melissa Whellams to speak now. Melissa, again, is an old friend. I haven't seen Melissa in, gosh, probably a couple of decades when she was with CDSR in Calgary, when I was still in Calgary. But Melissa is now a partner with Avanzar LLC, a boutique consultancy that specializes in social risk management in the extractive industries. She's been working all over the world with companies over the past 14 years on implementing the VPs, assessing human rights risks, related risks and impacts, and training corporate and site-based personnel and security staff on a wide variety of ESG topics, including human rights and the VPs. So Melissa, take it away.
Thanks, Reg. Yes, so I guess I was asked to speak a little bit more from my experience working with companies on the ground and the trends that we're seeing just in terms of security and human rights risk assessments and some new issues that are being raised, some of them in light of COVID and then others just in general. So I just wanted to talk about 5 different issues that I've seen as being, I guess, more of a concern lately to security personnel on site at different locations around the world. Some things that are a little bit less obvious than the original security and human rights risk assessments that we were doing. People obviously wanted to look at the risks with the private security providers that they had on site and the public security that maybe were contracted to site, but what are some of the risks maybe outside of that scope that companies should look at? So one of the things that we've seen become increasingly important is the company's relationship with public security that's not necessarily contracted to the site, but may provide security, police or military, gendarme, that may respond to protests associated with a mine site or an oil and gas site. and how does the company mitigate risk around that? So a lot of police forces around the world still use things like warning shots, which are highly controversial, and there's really no standard on that, but they are something that many people try to avoid using just because of the risk they can have to people, just stray bullets, that sort of thing. So anyway, how does a company manage the risks when they call in public security to help them if there's a road blockade or protest related to the site? That's a critical one. What can they do to mitigate that risk? And the other thing too is a lot of security forces don't necessarily have a range of equipment, so they may not have less than lethal options. They may only have lethal options. What do you do in those cases? The second thing we're seeing is just changes in the drivers of who's asking for risk assessments when it comes to security and human rights. And lately we've seen more companies being asked by insurance companies about what they're doing to mitigate their security and human rights related risks. One of our clients recently had an insurance company ask them what they're doing given the recent settlement that Petra Diamonds paid out for allegations related to human rights abuse, suffered by individuals related to security personnel at their sites. So they were asking, what are you doing to make sure that you're not in a similar situation? Something else we've seen just in terms of COVID and how that's impacted security and security risk assessments is in many cases, we've seen companies decrease the number of meetings that they've had in the community over the last year, which has, in some cases, weakened the relationship between the site and the community. And then what risk does that present to security, given that community is sort of the first line of protection, or the good relationship that you have with community is the first line of protection for the site. So if that relationship is a little more tenuous, then how does security respond to that? We're also seeing companies pay more attention to risks to vulnerable groups, particularly women and children, which is something that the Voluntary Principles has really been promoting. So making sure that security mitigates the risk to women and children. And it's been really a challenge for us to get security teams to wrap their head around how would they even possibly impact children and women directly if, say, for example, they don't have a lot of children or trespassers on site who are children or women. How would they possibly impact those groups? And we've got them sort of thinking outside the box in terms of things like, if there is a protest and community members do put children on the front lines, or they go with their parents to the protest, how might that impact children if there's a conflict between the protesters and security personnel or police, that sort of thing. Or if there are security arrangements that may impact, and women and children were going in there to collect water, which we've seen in some cases. If that's not consulted on prior to the establishment of the fence, then how does that impact those people and then their potential relationship with security personnel after the fence is put up? And then the last thing that I've seen, I guess, become more important, and we're really working hard with security teams on the ground, is their involvement with the community and how does that help mitigate risks. So a lot of times we have security teams say, look, it's really the role of the CSR team or the social team to go out and liaise with the community and engage with the community. We're just here to protect the mine site and when people come into the mine site. And we're finding that security teams that do go out into the community and proactively engage with the community, whether that be in security meetings to talk about security issues, security arrangements, or it just be volunteer activities, or in participating in sports games with the community, that really helps strengthen the relationship between the site and the community, mitigate risks, just in terms of if there is a conflict, if community people recognize them as individuals that they know and people that they can talk to and dialogue with, then it's a lot easier to resolve any kind of tense situation or conflict when they do arise. So I'm really just looking at how that can help mitigate risks on an ongoing basis. Those are kind of the 5 things that I've highlighted for changes that we've been seeing over the last year and a half or so, and I'll just leave it at that.
I'm off mute. Okay, thank you, Melissa. That was really helpful, and as one of the people that's actually on the road these days, you have a lot of on the ground experience that perhaps some of us are sitting behind our Zoom tables and desks right now aren't seeing, so it's really, really valuable. I'm going to ask Krista Henry to speak now. Krista is a very old friend. We go back many, many years. Krista's been working on security and human rights issues for the past 17 years, starting with the NGO Fund for Peace, which was actually part of the initial development of the VPs back in the day. Her focus has been on business and human rights with a focus on the extractive sector and in conflict areas. She served on the steering committee of the VPs for many years through lots of sticky issues. After a few years as executive director of the Fund for Peace, Krista began to pursue her work more closely with the private sector by joining MFC, international consultancy focused on social performance. She currently works with several international finance institutions to ensure conformance of projects with their performance standards related to security and human rights. She manages or supports teams working in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and on projects in extractives, renewables, agriculture, infrastructure, and conservation. So Krista has really been part of the evolution of the VPs from what was a very reactive, mining and oil and gas related political process as much as anything else from what I recall, to one now which is so much more broad-based and cross-sectoral. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So over to you, Kristen.
Great, thanks, Reg. And I just want to thank the Voluntary Principles Initiative and the Secretariat for putting this together. I mean, it's great to be with all these people again and to have this discussion. There's so many different ways we can talk about the trends over the years. I mean, this has really been, we've been working on this issue for 15, 20 years, but we were asked to think about it in terms of the last 18 months to some extent. And so I thought about it. A lot of this is building on the whole 10 years, but positive trends that I've seen, like 3 that I really want to focus on. Again, I'm going to focus on the positive first. What I've been seeing is really first the increased awareness of the voluntary principles. Again, longer trend, but I have seen it increased in the last 18 months. I mean, several factors contribute to this. We have people changing jobs who had awareness of the voluntary principles from their previous extractives. Commodity shifts can influence this, the importance of the renewable sector. But we also had an uptake of the international finance institutions, like Reg mentioned, that I work with, recognizing that when you talked about security and human rights, it made sense to tie it to something as well understood, as well formulated, as well thought out, as well implemented across different countries as the voluntary principles on security and human rights. As it is, because it was created for the extractive industry, it doesn't necessarily fit exactly every single industry scope, scale, or project, but the major components are there and it can be scaled to fit, I believe, any sector. And I'm really seeing that happen. Prime evidence is the people on this call today. The fact that there is such a high percentage of people that are not in the extractive industry. I mean, the interest in the topic itself is an example of this. Related to this very much, but I think really positive, is its actual use of the voluntary principles in these wide range of sectors. Like Reg mentioned, I started with the extractive industry. It was pretty obvious to be pulled into the renewables. That felt very natural. And it was actually guys calling me up saying, hey, now I'm with a renewable company. Can we work on that? But then it got moved into palm oil. And as Reg mentioned, now even in the conservation space. When people think about security and human rights, they really do think about the voluntary principles because it is well understood. And that's coming from, obviously extractive is so capital intensive that we're now actually looking at how to make it work in capital strapped sector. The ESG community, the IFIs, and their performance standards has been critical for that. And the third one, again, the third positive trend, very related to this, and gets a lot to the stuff that Melissa was bringing up and how Reg just is, when we talk about a security risk assessment these days, when you talk about a good one, it is informed by the voluntary principles on security and human rights. It looks at the impact of security's presence on a community. It looks at the impact of a security response to the community, as well as to the human rights of the security providers themselves and the public security forces. It's about the protection of people's safety paramount. And it really looks to understand why there might need to be a security response. And then working with community relations, like Melissa pointed out, the really good good security risk assessment will highlight, here's where these risks are emanating from. Let's step back and let's capture those before they become something at the gate that requires a security response. And so we're seeing a lot more proactive work and a lot more work across departments, which is really important, because the last thing we really want is a security incident. The assessment is there so that we can create management plans to mitigate the risks and to mitigate the impact of a security response. But if we can actually walk back even further and prevent the need for the security response at all, even better. And I think that the voluntary principles has made people understand that. So thank you.
No, thank you, Krista. That's very good. I'm now going to ask Jamie Williamson to speak. Jamie is the Executive Director of the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers Association, ICoCA, an international multi-stakeholder organization which brings together a global and diverse membership of private security providers, governments, and civil society organizations. As a governance body overseeing the implementation of an international code of conduct, the organization contributes to raising standards in the rapidly evolving global private security industry and ensures respect for human rights and national and international laws, notably in complex environments. I know how much work has gone into this process and into this code and how much leadership ICoCA has shown over the years. So I'm really interested in and excited to hear what Jamie has to say. So over to you, Jamie.
Good. Thank you very much, Reg, and thank you very much to the VPIs for organising this and inviting the association to be part of these discussions. It's difficult to actually do justice to what has been said so far, because a number of the points I was going to mention have been covered very eloquently by the previous speakers. But let me try and unpack exactly. So let me try and unpack some of the issues, very much focusing on the kind of the private security providers component, as distinct from the public security component. Before going into a bit more substance, Chess, I think it's good to go back to the point you made there, Reg, about the progress that the association has been making over the past few years. I mean, we were established by governments, multi-stakeholder approach, including a number of the folk and companies which are part of the VPIs, very much seen as that kind of implementation tool of elements of the VPIs specifically for private security providers. So it's been great over the past few years to be working closely with the Secretariat and with Maura and Patricia in particular over the past couple of years to see how we can really sort of connect the two and to strengthen that kind of gravitas on the private security piece and the great implementation. A few points. I mean, I don't know how many I have, so I'm not going to actually give you a number, but let's say at least 4 or 5. The first is maybe just to rebound on something John was saying at the very beginning in terms of the sort of knowing and the showing part. And to note, of course, you know, we have the 20th anniversary of the VPIs, the 10th anniversary of ICoCA last year, the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs this year. Was it last week? I think you mentioned, John. And question which I think is a tough one that we have to answer rather than looking backwards is, you know, okay, the what next? It's great, we've done well, we've been here 10 years, we've survived 20 years, but what next? The kind of so what? And I think this webinar, but also many of the discussions we've had over the past few weeks to mark these anniversaries, has, I think, highlighted we're at the crossroads that we find ourselves at. I mean, the tough questions are now being asked in terms of implementation. And building on what Krista and Melissa have mentioned as well, we are seeing the narrative change as well. There is a real narrative shift in terms of the communities, governments, other stakeholders, investor groups, etc., expecting more from these processes, looking for real impactful results, and no longer simply lip service or references to principles that we implement and oversee and verify every now and then. So real results. And that narrative shift, I think, has in part come because of COVID, and that's been a positive, I dare say. There's not that many positives that come out of COVID-19. But I think what COVID-19 demonstrated was the important role that business and security had to play during this pandemic. And we saw in many contexts the particularly important role that private security providers had to play, being listed as essential workers, being at the forefront in terms of the response. And then all the issues that they had to deal with in terms of the duty of care that they owed to clients, but also that clients owed to them, the management structures that had to be revamped, and the sort of the emergency structures put in place to manage all the health constraints and PPE and all the sort of infrastructure that had to be put in place to manage COVID-19. Larger questions beyond the physical security, but also the mental well-being of security guards and clients, because we saw individuals being stuck in context, not being rotated out, and then Also, and this has been less, I think, obvious from a security trend perspective, the maritime footprint. There were major question marks in terms of the treatment of seafarers, which also included security providers. And the fact that rather than being in and out every 4 weeks, I had reports a few weeks ago that some were stuck offshore for 180 days at a time on floating armories and beyond. So questions that have to be asked in that regard in terms of, okay, we can deal with land, it's visible, but what about sort of the maritime piece? The second point in terms of narrative shift, which has gone towards the negative, and this is going back to, in particular, what Melissa and Krista were saying, I think the accountability component across sectors. In the last 18 months, we have seen numerous stories, and I think John and I were on an event a few weeks ago where I alluded to some of these, numerous stories involving different sectors, the agribusiness, avocado, commercial, major supermarkets, diamonds, sporting events, FIFA, Qatar, etc., where issues vis-a-vis both the treatment of security guards, but also the actions of security personnel on local communities has come to the fore. And we have seen a question of accountability, potential litigation, but also major reputational as well as financial hits on the clients of those security personnel. And so there's going to be bigger discussions beyond the extractive going forward as to how do we work on this sort of human rights due diligence, human rights risk and human rights impact issues and security risk issues across different sectors, and maybe draw from the best practices that have come out of VPIs and ICoCA the past few years to feed into different sectors. We're also seeing as maybe a third trend, kind of sort of new leverage. And Melissa and John, I think you definitely mentioned those questions of, and definitely Krista as well, the investor community. So we've seen delisting by the major investor groups, and we've seen that specifically vis-a-vis major security contractors. I'm not going to list names of companies, but certainly funds like the Norwegian Sovereign Fund delisted a couple of security companies, which had major impacts on their share value. We have seen, and also created a positive narrative in terms of the company wanting to do better. We're seeing situations of de-risking by banks growing, and we're working with ABN AMRO as one example, where banks are now de-risking their own financial products, where there's a potential security and human rights risk along the supply chain. And there's a number of other areas I could point to as well. For instance, insurance companies too have also upped the ante a little bit, because provision of insurance for security providers in high-risk environments was quite limited in terms of the companies, brokers offering specific products. So we've also seen a greater understanding on the part of the insurance companies, but also in terms of private security providers and their clients of the importance that insurance plays and the potential for dropping premiums if security providers and their clients can demonstrate that they're taking on board all the relevant security and human rights obligations, be it from the VPIs or the sort of ICoCA combined. And then last point, so we can sort of open up for questions. Despite, I think, many of the clear trends, there is still a level of confusion as to the appropriate response. And there's a clearly, and this morning I was on an intergovernmental panel, clearly a confusion as to the role and types of actors we're seeing in different contexts. I can turn to, and we can unpack that during the Q&A, Mozambique and Central African Republic in particular, where there's been a complete array of actors, humanitarian, extractive, military, mercenary, security, major humanitarian as well as environmental issues, and other questions vis-a-vis humanitarian law and human rights abuses. And the security piece has all come under the same label. And it's quite often the acronym, the PMSC acronym, that's used to label everything which is deemed security. And the nuanced discussions in terms of public security, private security, and where responsibility lies has been missed. And I think there will be a focus in the next few months, if not next few years, on locations like Mozambique to really have a stronger, more robust and rigorous discussion as to how do we improve the situation, rather than simply paying lip service to standards or principles that we may, echo chamber every now and then. I'll stop there, Reg. I know I maybe overshot by a couple of minutes, but there were quite a few issues.
Oh, that's great, Jamie. I think you've teed up a lot of really interesting stuff for us to get a little deeper into here. I'm going to take a quick look at the Q&As and see. I think I'd perhaps like to start a little higher level in terms of the Q&As, and back to John. John, you talked about how the VPs predated the guiding principles and Ruggie's process. you know, there's been a lot of water under the bridge. Since then, there's now such a movement towards climate and climate justice, and, you know, initiatives like TFCD. You know, the whole concept of the VPs, if I'm, you know, from my experience, the concept of risk management, due diligence, you know, assessing risk, engaging with stakeholders on the ground to understand those risks and communicating those risks in your mitigation plans isn't rocket science. And, you know, the framework that the VPs have established, you know, is applicable so far, you know, beyond just obviously the extractive sectors Krista has talked about in terms of other industries, but even in terms of other issues. You know, how do you see all the work and all the thinking and all the kind of alignment that's gone on over the past 20 years with respect to that basic framework around assessment, engagement, communication, mitigation, et cetera, and the need for grievance mechanisms, et cetera? How do you see that kind of playing its way into some of these bigger issues like climate change and climate justice, et cetera, or are you seeing it going in a different direction?
Wow, that's a big question. I think, I mean, what's been interesting is since the VP started, there are, you know, other business sectors now have discussions around human rights. Sometimes that does include security issues. So that's a good thing. It's also a good thing that we do have this ESG umbrella that brings, you know, everything that we talk about in the VPs and the GPs into this much broader discussion. But it's a mixed blessing, to be honest, Reg. I mean, I think Krista mentioned that some of the multilateral banks get the VPs now. So I think the IFC does, the EBRD and others. But if you look more broadly at the finance sector that is really driving the climate, the E and the ESG, there's very little understanding of the S, right? Certainly in rights terms. And I would imagine very little understanding of security and human rights, therefore, which is strange because we're moving into a tougher operating context in many parts of the world now. I mean, you know, this morning another newspaper closed in Hong Kong. You don't need me to tell you about what's happened in Myanmar recent months. You know, we're moving into situations that are probably more like the 1990s than they were 10 years ago, which makes initiatives like the VPs even more important, but it does raise the bar in terms about what it means to work in tough security contexts that aren't just about a particular location of operation, but you know, whole countries or regions of countries are tough operating environments, and there are calls for boycotts and sanctions, and all of this stuff is coming back. So I think, yeah, Reg, I mean, I think there's been a sort of spreading of the coffee across the table, but and I think it's good that we link this thing to climate and those transitions, but that we've got a real fight on our hands to get I would say the sort of green utopian lobby to understand that they're pushing for a 300% increase in copper, for example, by 2050. Where's this copper going to come from? If, you know, new mines, seabeds, Arctic, you know, indigenous lands, you know, even the demand for green commodities could cause conflict, right? And create new security dynamics. And I just don't see that conversation happening at the moment. Thanks. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, when I first got into this area in the late 90s, you know, Burma, Myanmar were at the front of the newspaper when it came to Premier Oil and Chevron, and Total, of course, and now we're back again, full circle. It's incredible, actually, how things. Hopefully, there's better tools in place now, and there's better engagement strategies and whatnot. But you know, the broad context doesn't always change. Some of this goes back. And I would also invite, you know, I don't want to be the one just asking all the questions or commenting. I think if others on the panel have contributions or want to ask a question or chase an issue down, please feel free to unmute and jump in. I intend this to be a conversation amongst friends as much as anything else, but please feel free. I wanted to follow up also.
If I could, Reg, as you've made an invitation there, and maybe it's to rebound on something that I think all of you mentioned, the ESG part. And you said it's maybe whether it's a good or a bad dynamic, and the S part in the ESG. I think all mentioned the social, the security, the human rights. And the more we look at the whole ESG framework, the more confused one can become in terms of actually what are the standards, what should we be looking at? How do you change that narrative? How do you actually become more granular in terms of what's required under the S? Do any of the rest of the panelists have some kind of ideas or solutions that we can offer up on this one? Sorry, Reg, thanks.
Please.
I don't do all the talking, but I'll be quick. I mean, I think governments know already. They know that one of the biggest impediments to transition is social, right? It's political and social. I mean, we just look at the recent American election. Many elections are about not stranding communities, and the fears of communities, you know, to do with traditional high carbon industries. And this can cause civil unrest as well. So I think somehow we don't have to make the case for the social in ESG. What I think is happening is that elected officials and governments are maybe too afraid to talk about this stuff openly as much as they should, and therefore we're not bringing the toolkits and the processes that we have already and developed over the past 20 years into the same room as COP26, for example, which is a shame. I think we'll get there, to be honest, but I think some of the resistance is sort of political fear to do that, in my view, at least.
I also think that some of the social stuff is being started to be addressed a little bit more with a lot of the modern slavery initiatives that have come out from various governments in the UK, Australia, sitting in the Senate in Canada. We've got Europe talking about that. And I think supply chain issues are becoming more and more important, and they're starting to look at softer pieces related to labor, and then, you know, some of the other issues that surround modern slavery. So I think that slowly we're starting to see it become a little bit more prominent, just in terms of what's on you know, the government's radar and companies' radar, not so much entirely focused on the environmental that we've seen in the past.
Just kind of to that, I want to say, you know, there are these prominent issues, kind of the sexy issues, the things that get attention or that people really hone in on. I like looking at the frameworks like the IFC performance standards and the EBRD performance requirements, because they give a structure that's thought through all of the different social aspects, hits on all of those things that are actually prominent and have the news, but make sure that we cover all of the yes. So like John was saying, I think a lot of the things are there. We haven't brought the tools yet forward so that people can really see them and they're accessible and they get used, like E was very good at doing. We just have to do that now for S. And S being security too, not just social.
Indeed. So I've got a number of questions here in the Q&A box. I'm going to throw a few of them out to the group here. Please, can we have some examples of security risks? I believe that many risk assessments are too business-centric. How do we change the narrative and focus on rights holders?
I could take that one because I was asked when we were talking about doing security risk assessments with the IFC. One of the things I kept coming back to is, well, where's the risk to the communities? And so what we built into the security risk framework was, what's the risk? And somebody actually also asked in the Q&A, where does criminality sit? Like local criminality might be kind of a condition that may cause, for example, a petty theft to occur, which might cause a response from a security to occur. What does that security response mean, even to the thief or to the community? And so it's that thinking through constantly, like, why is there a security incident and how does that incident affect the rights holders, which include those that might actually be committing some of the crimes at the sites, as well as those who have to respond. You know, the rights holders include the security people themselves.
And if I may, Reg, from our perspective, what we've been looking at as well is the impact assessment rather than simply the security risk to the company itself. I think quite often companies go into a situation where they look at the risk to themselves in a particular location, where in actual fact what we want to try to drive the narrative towards is what's the impact on the local communities from the actions of that particular security company, and for them to go through that process. We've just developed literally this week a human rights impact assessment guide specifically for security providers to help them think differently about how to address some of these issues in country.
Reg, I'll throw it. Melissa, you go first. I'll go after you.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that one of the things that we try to get people to do is both of you had just said already about kind of switching the perspective and not talking so much about how something impacts the company. We used to do a lot of social risk assessments and looking at the risks to the company's operations and their social license to operate. But it's kind of turning everything on its head and saying, what are the risks to your stakeholders, to the rights holders themselves? And I think the big, or one of the things that have helped a lot in helping companies understand this is giving them a good understanding of what human rights are and what rights we actually have. And so doing a lot of training with security personnel on what are the security related human rights, and, you know, things like what are your rights in arrest and detention, what are your rights in, you know, freedom of assembly and protest, that sort of thing. So when you can actually understand what the rights themselves are, then when you talk about a particular situation, you can say, okay, what are the impacts of that scenario, and then what rights are specifically being impacted. And then that gets people thinking about, okay, wait, how do my actions specifically impact human rights? So that's the way we've kind of communicated and the way that we look at it with companies.
I definitely agree with that. And this is the work I'm trying to push at the World Economic Forum at the moment. And you can imagine it's good that the World Economic Forum has a Human Rights Council now, but what we're trying to do is say to non-executive directors, board members around the world, you know, your duties as a board member are no longer going to be purely fiduciary. In years to come, and in Europe first, but maybe everywhere soon, environmental and social issues are going to become legal responsibilities for you as the person, as one of the people who is actually responsible for what a company does. I think there's a real in there, because, as I said earlier, very few boards have the right competence, the right to even ask the right questions of the due diligence and the risk assessments. And then, as what Melissa said, at the other end of the telescope are the communities and the rights holders themselves. And I don't know many companies, if you ask them the question, which people on this planet are most vulnerable to you getting it wrong, but also might benefit most from you getting it right around security issues. And that can include gender-based violence and things that happen outside of the perimeter of operations. How many companies have, I mean, they might have a risk register, but do they have a vulnerability register? Mm-hmm. Do they know actively the individuals and groups who are most vulnerable to their actions and inactions any day of the week? That's the level of granularity I think we need to get to.
Kind of on a related point, question here. Community engagement is another key challenge. How do we go about engaging communities on VPs? Many believe security information cannot be shared with our communities. And Melissa and Krista, maybe I'll put this to you, and it's a broader issue as well. We talk about COVID, and, you know, prior to the panel going live, we were talking about the challenges of travel and, you know, how difficult it is to get to where you need to go, either as a consultant or as a corporate member of a corporate team, where you may not have up and running operations, you don't have local staff. How do you guys see this world unfolding over the next few years? I mean, travel is much curtailed. I think that people have seen the power of remote, engagement. We're doing it right now. But what are your thoughts in terms of, community engagement being so important and the ability to sit down with people and talk face to face and demonstrate empathy and connectivity? What's going to happen to this field, and how are we going to adapt to this new reality of kind of logistical challenges of getting to where we need to go?
Big question. Yeah, I mean, we have seen building a lot more capacity at the local level, so that there's a less need for individuals to fly in from other places. One of the big ones, just in terms of getting community engagement and security working well together, is it's not necessarily that communities engagement needs to give out security information or vice versa. They need to be working together cross-departmentally. They need to be training together. They need to be assessing risks together. They need to be creating the management frameworks even together, and then go about their duties and their work with the communities or with the security or with public security, maybe separately, but always with an understanding why they're doing it together, and having some shared goals and shared understanding of the context in which they're operating. And that really means also from the international down to the local, so that the community liaisons are in on these discussions. And somebody also asked in the Q&A about whether the security departments should be doing the security risk assessments or whether it should be outsourced. I'm a big fan of the security departments not only being critical in it if they're not leading it, but also the other departments too. And I believe that it should be people from the staff that are doing the risk assessments. They can get some support They can get outside advisors, they can get some facilitation, they can get some assistance, but I really believe the people that are having to manage the day-to-day and really have those connections on the ground are the ones that should be doing the assessment.
Because the engagement on the risk assessment itself is a mitigation in terms of how security is provided in the relationship with the community. So it's really difficult to pull this apart. You still need some level of third-party assurance, obviously. I'm sure, Jamie, you have a thought on that as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Melissa was next. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jamie.
No, please, after you.
I was going to add to what Krista was saying just about the engagement with the community, and even what Reg just mentioned about engaging with the community on the risk assessment piece itself. So, I mean, it's funny, we often get security company or security teams say to us, well, we can't engage with the community on our security arrangements because they're private, and if we give them all the information, they'll know what we're doing, and then they'll use that information against us. And it's not about that at all. It's more kind of taking it from like a community policing perspective, which a lot of police forces use around the world, just in terms of engaging with the community, getting community people to, you know, feel comfortable approaching the police if there's a problem, giving the police information if there's a problem, knowing that the police are there to help them as opposed to, you know, harm them in a certain situation. So it's the same kind of idea, is engaging with the community up front about what are the concerns going on in the community. The community will approach you if they see that there's risks, talk about crimes in the area so the community teams are aware of what's happening in the community and can put the adequate measures in place, but also talk about, you know, like I said before, security arrangements. If there's something new popping up on the security arrangements that could negatively impact the community, then talk to them about what's going to happen and how that may impact their access to something, or, you know, or access through the mindset, whatever it may be. So I think from that point, engagement with the community is critical.
And I would add also the sort of the localization, the grand bargain discussions today about how do we give more, how do we empower more the local civil society organizations, because clearly COVID-19 and going back to what we had a few years ago of having sort of the international elements flying in to do some of the evaluation and community engagement is not going to sort of be a pattern we can see in the next few years. Instead, we have to focus on what the local capacity is and what civil society organizations can do there, and how we can develop strategic partnerships with them without being too aloof in terminology. And that does require resources, but also requires trust to be built between the local CSOs and communities and the clients/security providers on the other side. In addition to that, and that's where the pincer movement comes in, there's a question there about, you know, leadership by governments, by regulators. They cannot be absent, and they have to be part of that discussion. The VPIs and ICoCA have the same 7 or 10 governments at the table. There's plenty others out there that say they're doing the necessary, but in my mind, until such time as governments are stepping up in those contexts, you're still going to have a level of mistrust from local communities when they see governments engaging with major international clients and there's a security human rights element. So how we get more governments to the table will also be a major challenge, I think, going forward.
Absolutely. We're certainly not going to get to all the Q&As, but I really appreciate all of you scanning these questions as they've been coming in and weaving them into your answer. That's very, very helpful. But I'd be remiss, Jamie, if I didn't ask you to unpack a little bit. You talked about the situation in Central African Republic and Mozambique and PMSE, and be interesting just to get just a couple of minutes talking about kind of what's happening there in terms of recent trends. And I'd be really fascinated to get, you know, Krista and Melissa specifically, your kind of view of that from perhaps a more on the ground level as well. So if we could spend a couple of minutes just chatting about that, that'd be really great.
A couple of minutes for Mozambique and Central African Republic. I'll be very, very short. Yeah. I think for those of you who've been following the Mozambique situation, especially in the north, the Cabo Delgado region, the combination of the LNG, the major extractive sort of setups, humanitarian disaster that's been going on for quite a while, the local insurgency as well as cross-border insurgency that's taken place, the incapacity of the public security and sort of the militaries to act, the involvement of Russian and then South African military contractors in inverted commas, for better or for worse, there were some good stories, there were some bad stories as well. And then the entire private security footprint operating alongside not only the extractives in those regions, but also the private security providers acting alongside aid agencies, diplomatic missions, and others. We saw the headlines a few months ago. There's been a large drive with the VPIs and others to put up, the kind of standards that have to be respected. But in my mind, that's insufficient, because we are entering into a phase in that region. It could be the next 5, 10, 15 years where much more granularity needs to be looked at. Because a lot of the narrative I heard, even this morning was everything's being seen as big oil, mercenaries, and radicalization. And I think the communities and human rights issues are being pushed aside and not being discussed as robustly as possible. That was my short 2 minutes. I couldn't, I could go much longer if you wanted me to, but I shan't.
We don't have all day, and that was really good, Jamie. Any thoughts from the panel on that?
I do agree. When you hear things in the news versus when you get on the ground and you're actually at the community level and you're seeing how the people are actually impacted, it's quite different, right? And so, there are some solutions that are going to come from the international community and from governments national, but then there are some things that just really need to be granular and localized. So we can't rely on the news to really understand a situation. I don't think any of us would try, which is why I'm not going to speak about Mozambique. I also have too many friends that might be on the call that know it all too well. So I'm going to pass.
And Central African Republic is a different set of issues, but of course there, the headline news right now is the involvement of the Wagner Group and its connection with potentially the government as well as UN peacekeepers, but there's a whole security apparatus behind that. And what does that look like from the private-public partnership as well?
Great, thank you guys. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to try to peg off a few of the questions we've received here that I don't think we've hit. What should companies do when the RA indicates serious potential for conflict and violence, especially when public security fails to respond appropriately or due to unwillingness or incapacity?
I like this one, so I wanted to jump in because one of the answers one would sometimes give is, work to get the memorandum of understanding, right? But then somebody else asked in the Q&A, what do you do when a memorandum of understanding isn't possible? And this gets to my favorite answer, which is a memorandum of understanding is a great document if you can get one, but it is the process of building the shared understanding of the needs, the risks, the why isn't security responding or public security responding in the way that it is? How can anyone who's operating in that area assist so public security can respond professionally and responsibly? And that relationship that's built in the process of getting an MOU is more important than the MOU itself. So I think if we kind of need to sometimes stop talking about the MOU and really start just thinking about managing the relationship. And that means building trust, understanding, and real relationships built on shared understanding.
Absolutely agree.
I think from my perspective too, it's trying to understand what the source of the conflict is. So if your risk assessment shows that there's potential for conflict, is the conflict specifically related to the mine site, or is it conflict between tribes in the area? Is it political conflict? What is the actual source of the conflict? Because that obviously will help you decide how to address the issue. If it is mine related, then let's say people are upset about a resettlement or about potential contamination of the local water sources, then obviously you can deal with the root of the problem there. If it's a tribal issue, then obviously it's working with the government and local authorities in that scenario. And then I would say that the other thing I've seen that's done really well is companies that have brought in third parties who specialize in conflict resolution and conflict training and doing participatory theater, things like that in the community, so they understand how to resolve conflict in a less violent way. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can address that.
Very good, thank you. I think this is gonna be the last question, and then we'll wrap things up. But Jamie, it's towards you, I believe. Where there are perceptions about private security services, should they be treated as impacts or risks? What's the best way to approach such and ensure the perception is being dealt with? I'm sure the situation that private security has to deal with in multiple jurisdictions.
It's security and a risk. So it's both a risk and an impact. And how do you approach it? It's exactly what we're trying to do right now. It's trying to bring them out of the woods as such. I mean, we have plenty of security providers out there that have that level of dialogue, transparency, are involving management, legal, training, and doing the necessary, and want to have these discussions. But there's plenty out there that are simply not part of that discussion. And I think that's the main challenge, both from the impact side, but also in terms of the risk side. And the negative for the industry as a whole, you have one or two bad players out there, then the entire industry is tarnished. And so it's, I think, the responsibility of the industry and all key actors to try to bring all of the relevant stakeholders in the security industry to the table to try and to unpack these issues and maybe move away from these kind of commercial dynamics and competitive sort of naysayers and recognize, actually, if we do raise standards across the board, then we're all going to benefit from it somehow, not simply as a company, maybe commercially, but certainly from a human rights perspective.
There's no competitive advantage in your competitor companies failing in these very critical areas, whether you're a security provider or an extractive company. There's just no benefit to anyone. So. Well, I think that kind of has taken us to the end of our time. It flew by. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad we had a discussion and a conversation as much as anything else. So unless there are other comments or points people want to make, I think we'll probably just wrap things up. Maura, if you're still on the line, I think we're probably just going to sign off from here. Thank you very much for everyone for your participation and your good questions, and we apologize for not getting to them all.